Hello, everyone. Bonjour à vous tous. My name is Alia Gina, and I am your MC for this first session. On behalf of the entire organizing team, in conjunction with the Trico Charitable Foundation and the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary, we wish you a warm welcome to the Pivot on Purpose Summit. We are delighted that you are here and so excited for what we have in store for you over the next 3 days. De la part de nous tous à l'Université de Calgary, nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue. In 2017, the University of Calgary implemented an Indigenous engagement strategy for the journey to reconciliation. One aspect of that includes a land acknowledgement. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Together with you, the participants in today's event, we acknowledge and respect the relationships and rights of Indigenous peoples around the world to their traditional lands, territories, waters, coastal seas, and resources, as described in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have attendees from across the world attending today. So if a land acknowledgement is something you do in your home country, we invite you to share one from the region you are joining us from in the chat. If this practice is new to you, we challenge you to take some time to learn more about the traditional keepers of the land where you are from. Welcome to POP, the acronym we've lovingly given to the Pivot on Purpose Summit. Avant qu'on commence, j'aimerais vous rappeler que la traduction française sera disponible tout au long de cette conférence. And now, a welcome address from the Government of Alberta.
Hi, I'm Dimitros Nicolaitis, Alberta's Minister of Advanced Education. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you this evening and bring greetings on behalf of Premier Jason Kenney and my other cabinet colleagues. Today is a very important milestone for the Trico Charitable Foundation as Social Enterprise celebrates its 10th anniversary. Social Enterprise shines as a spotlight on those organizations using business models and strategies to innovate and seek solutions to the social problems facing our province and our society. Success can be achieved and is achieved by organizations balancing an entrepreneurial approach and compassion for social change. I'm pleased to know that the University of Calgary and the Haskayne School of Business are working with the Trico Charitable Foundation on bringing to light the great work that's occurring in our communities. Alberta's post-secondary community is always willing to lend its support for important initiatives and programs. This balanced approach to social change is creating new jobs, careers, and opportunities for our province, our society, and Albertans to realize a brighter future. On behalf of all Albertans, a warm thank you to the Trico Charitable Foundation and the Haskayne School of Business for hosting this celebration of excellence and hard work in our province. Once again, congratulations to those individuals and organizations being recognized today. Your work on behalf of social change and advancing the opportunities of Albertans in both entrepreneurship and addressing our society's challenges is incredibly valued and is making a real difference. Once again, thank you and enjoy your evening.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Dewald. I'm the Dean at the Haskayne School of Business, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to Pivot on Purpose. Now, this goes back a bit because we got to go back to 2008, and the Trico Foundation was formed by Wayne and Eleanor Chu, great Calgarians, and Dan overall has been leading this organization with a total focus on social enterprise, which really warms my heart. 2 years ago, we formed a partnership and ran the social enterprise event together and thought, well, we can do much more. And so I'm just so proud of, you met Alia, already, and Kylie Zhu and Elizabeth Henderson. There's a team of about a dozen people who have really focused on what can we do more? How can we make this something much more special? And Pivot on Purpose was developed, and now we have 600 people who have registered, which is quite amazing for the next couple of days, plus another 160, I think, students for the case competition. So this is a tremendous success. And I'm really pleased about it because I think it works by saying on purpose. Like, it's no accident. This is pivoting on purpose, and it's moving towards social entrepreneurship and social enterprise on purpose. As the Dean of Business School, nothing could make me happier, because this idea that a business corporation is about making money for a few shareholders is so small-minded, it's so old, it's got to be thrown out. I look for the day when every organization is a social enterprise, and it starts by thinking on purpose. How can we turn from being this to being that? We have converts here, 600 of you that have said, yes, I buy into this. I see the enlightenment. I see the transformation. I see the change, and I'm behind it. And that's what makes the next 2 days, the next 3 days so exciting, because we can share and we can learn along this same path together. POP is also developing lasting partnerships and collaboration in the wider communities with initiatives like Social Enterprise World Academic Forum, the Alberta Social Economy Ecosystem Development, and the Canadian Sustainable Finance Network. We're committed to these community linkages and amplifying each other's work. Thank you so much for joining in on this. I'm so happy to welcome you from across the globe as members of Pivot on Purpose. And I just want to mention, as Elia said, we are in Treaty 7 land in Calgary, Alberta. And I wanted to show you, this is our school, the Haskayne School of Business, from my office. Welcome, everyone. Have a great time. Enjoy this, and let's celebrate together.
Thank you for that, Jim. I'm Dan Overall, Executive Director of the Trico Foundation, and I would like to echo Jim's comments of gratitude for what's made this event possible, in particular Team Haskayne, who have been absolutely fantastic. But I'd really like to build on Jim's comments about the intention behind Pivot on Purpose. The grand theme for this summit is reimagining how business models can be used to solve social problems. And the name Pivot on Purpose really resonated with us because it ties into that theme in at least 3 key ways. Number one, it taps into a conversation the corporate sector is having on its own pivot on purpose, namely, as Jim says, reconsidering that the purpose of a corporation is more than simply maximizing profits. And in Jim's wonderful keynote from 2019, he tried to assure the corporate sector that they had nothing to fear in social entrepreneurship. It was not socialism, it was not communism, because the corporate sector actually has an extensive history about caring about social impact. I'd actually like to build on that sentiment. The essence of entrepreneurship is generating revenue by solving a problem. So a conversation about reimagining how business models can solve social problems is one of the most entrepreneurial conversations we could have. Social entrepreneurship does not distract us from the grand promise of entrepreneurship. It fulfills that grand promise. Point number 2. Pivot is about change and purpose is about intention. So Pivot on Purpose is a reminder that in our change agenda, we must be very intentional. I'll just give you one example of what I'm talking about. The 1960s was an era where there seemed to be great momentum and promise of change. People were taking to the streets. They were advocating for civil rights, the environment, and many other issues. Here's how Hunter S. Thompson has written about that moment. There was a feeling of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. But now, with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. So today, people are in the streets. And there's also this great promise of change because social impact in various forms is being discussed more and more. Our grand challenge as a movement is not only to ride that wave, but to lay the groundwork and be ready for when inevitably the wave breaks and tries to roll back. Number 3, the name Pivot on Purpose reminds us that we need to refocus on the purpose of events like this. And that purpose is actually you. Specifically, we need an event that empowers you with the tools and the ideas that you need to take your journey to the next step. And we've tried our best to do that, this event, by making 80% of these sessions literally about answering the questions you have. But we can do better and we're committed to do better. That's why in future iterations of POP, for those that you are willing, we'd like to have a deeper conversation with you as to exactly what your needs are so that we can make sure we have the topics and tap into the expertise that again is specifically designed to help you get to the next level in your journey. And you'll be receiving a post-POP survey that will ask whether you're willing to participate in those conversations with us. So thank you and welcome to POP.
And now we start with our first session, an introduction to Neil and Jonathan. Dan, over to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome Neil and Jonathan. Just in terms of some context, there's no doubt that Scotland is a leader in social entrepreneurship. And the ecosystem that's trying to support that conversation is so rich. And we could have had so many attendees. In fact, Canada does have a bit of a legacy in ongoing conversations with Scotland as to how we can not only learn from each other, but work together. And Jerry Higgins of CEIS jumps out as someone who's been an incredible leader. But we're particularly excited about having Neil and Jonathan join us in this conversation today because they're probably, as far as we can tell, leaders in bringing the social entrepreneurship conversation to education institutions in Scotland and around the world. Neil is a leader in the aspect of leadership and leadership training when it comes to social entrepreneurship, which I don't think is talked about enough in Canada. Jonathan is doing fantastic work on the startup side of social entrepreneurship. And they both seem to be involved in almost every kind of key step that Scotland has taken on its social entrepreneurship journey. And in fact, interestingly, Jonathan seems to be the lead author in almost every single report that captures those insights. So we're so thrilled to have both these gentlemen as part of this conversation. And again, as I said in my opening greetings, this conversation is really about you. So please get ready for questions that you have, either as a social entrepreneurship ecosystem builder, if you'd like to get tips from them or insights from their journey, or even as a social entrepreneur, if you're looking at how an ecosystem would actually need to support you or challenges that you have. But before we open it up for questions, I'll start off. Now, the Scottish government actually has received a lot of news for the fact that it announced a 10-year strategy on developing social entrepreneurship in Scotland. What's less well known is about 2 years before that, the social entrepreneurship sector in Scotland itself came together and developed a 10-year vision for the sector. So gentlemen, I just wanted to start off by kind of digging in your views of how important was it in terms of getting government buy-in to develop that strategy first by the sector? And how important was it to have the sector ready in terms of knowing what it wanted when the government came knocking with this opportunity of actually developing a social enterprise strategy. And we can start with maybe you, Neil, if you're willing to lead off for us.
Sure. Thanks, Dan, and thank you very much for having us. I think in that case, it was more of a longer term conversation than that, in my view. The first document that came out of the Scottish Government was probably 10 years previously, looking at an enterprising third sector action plan, as they called it at the time. They kind of stopped short of calling it social enterprise. But just before we came on, Jonathan and I were just reminiscing about a trip that we took to Canada together, which was really instrumental in the Scottish Government thinking about a long-term strategy. And it was actually a visit to the Osoyoos band of Native Canadians when we were there, who had a business planning horizon that was 7 generations long. So we were quite modest in getting a 10-year strategy by comparison to your local neighbours there. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think it's fair to say that Scotland's been in a journey probably from around 2005, where the first mention of a social economy programme, social enterprise strategy, and various iterations and evolutions of that came about. I think it probably started first with programme before policy, which evolved into strategy and an action plan. So for me, it's been quite a long-term commitment from the government in Scotland in its various forms over the last 2 decades, which really came together in around 2015 to shape what became that 10-year strategy. It was developed, I think it's fair to say, as a broad consensus from within the sector and sector leaders around what the vision and priorities for Scotland should be in terms of this social economy, and then bringing the Scottish Government into that discussion. But it was very much based on consensus or co-design or co-production, or whatever term you want to use for that.
There's some aspects there that I'd like to actually unpack. I was really intrigued by your phrase, Jonathan, of program before policy. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Probably since around 2005, there was major uncoordinated programs of support for the social economy in Scotland. That seemed to be a fairly pragmatic response to a number of things that came together around a recognition of the importance of the social sector in Scotland, the availability of some funding, UK-based funding at the time, and a willingness to, I guess, accelerate a number of aspects to ecosystem development that were going on at the time, the creation of some funds, intermediary structures, some pilot programs. So it was really a set of initiatives that were given a sense of coherence within a program called Future Builders at the time. There was a document that was called a social economy policy around 2007, but it probably wasn't until over 10 years later that there was, I think, a more coherent Scottish Government-led policy responses to say, look, having reflected on this, this is our long-term ambition for Scotland, and this is the shape of policy and funding support that we would like to put in place.
It's interesting. I love the fact that even though you're from separate organizations, you're actually literally in the same room, because the Scottish social enterprise support system seems so integrated and so well connected. And the conversations about social entrepreneurship can be so diverse and can be so passionate that it's easy to kind of fracture. How was the Scottish approach and the ecosystem able to have those conversations as a sector and still have like a basis of consensus and not kind of split apart in division?
I think if I can start on that one, pass back to Jonathan. Again, you mentioned people like Jerry Higgins, who was an exceptional leader in this context, and also organizations like Scott, who created the academy, set up other parts of the ecosystem, but were very adept at bringing parts of the ecosystem together, either creating it or including people in the conversation. We then had a government who were, depending on the civil servants, I suppose, to some extent, but a government that came on that trip to Canada with us, with a group of key leaders from the sector and the ecosystem, having the conversation together to say, how can we do this together as leaders to move this forward? So I do think it was genuinely conversation taking place in the ecosystem, as you alluded to, but also conversation with the civil servants in partnership, informally, over time, before the strategy was formally engaged with. And at the time that strategy came together, I think there was an exceptional civil servant who came to Canada, who was very strong at creating a broad tent under which everyone could coexist, rather than creating division. And that individual, Yvonne Strachan, happens to be our chair now, and is a highly skilled individual. I think Jonathan would point to that as well. You need people on both sides of the equation who can see the big picture in the long term. And it's so easy for these things to fragment into coalitions or polarized groups, that it needs people with big picture thinking, like Jerry, like Yvonne, who can hold this stuff together.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I suppose it's a little bit like the alignment of planets at the time, a very conducive policy environment, some quite progressive, forward-thinking sort of policymakers, civil servants at the time, and sector leaders that were at a time and a place where I think everyone was ready for a more strategic rather than piecemeal approach to what had been developing over the previous 10 years in Scotland. So I think it was a time and place, certainly in Scotland, that was ready to develop that sort of shared sense of ambition and to provide a more coherent sense of what this tent should look like and what our shared ambitions are. So yeah, it was very much time and a place and a set of circumstances that lend itself well to moving forward together.
The term that was used widely at the time, Dan, was co-produced. So the strategy was viewed as something that was co-produced between the sector, the ecosystem and government together. And I think that was an appropriate term.
I think the other point is it would be naive to say if that not everyone came with the same perspective. Everyone had a slightly different perspective on the needs. Everyone had a set of interests around how the social economy should be developed in Scotland, and a set of perspectives in terms of their background, aspirations, their client group, and their expectations of the sector. But I think they were well aligned enough. And the process of strategy development and the scope of the strategy was broad and inclusive rather than to exclude certain parts. So the tent was broad enough, the discussion was broad enough, and circumstances at the time allowed that to move forward together.
In terms of that kind of big picture thinking, I've noticed in the Scottish documents that they always tie the social enterprise journey into that bigger theme of the aspirations of a more just and inclusive economy. So I'm imagining having that, seeing social entrepreneurship as a means to an end, not an end of itself, is crucial for keeping those conversations both inclusive and on track.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation, Dan. And interestingly, Yvonne Strachan, who was the civil servant involved heavily at that time, she saw social entrepreneurship as the vehicle through which equalities could be achieved. So her interest was actually the equalities in a fairer, more just world, and saw that in the social enterprise business model that was inherently baked in, and fundamentally, as you say, a means to an end, not an end in itself. So we often talk about social entrepreneurship, the verb, rather than social enterprise, the entity. legal type being more significant. As we go around the world, different places have different language for these things, but actually the behaviour and the using enterprise to achieve social change is the significant thing rather than the legal entity definition. And I see someone's asking that question about what is a social enterprise, what isn't a social enterprise. You know, that's something we've spent many hours over many evenings and many beers debating.
Yeah, and
Actually, we're finding that the approach of the challenge of, I've heard the phraseology of it's a verb rather than a noun, but then I found that people will say that and then treat social ownership as a noun anyway. So it's trying to get a language that captures more about, and what we're trying to do with Trico is we're saying definition has its place, but it's more about potential, i.e. what do you want to do with social entrepreneurship? Where do you want to go? So it's interesting hearing that Scotland is having like a similar dynamic.
yeah, it's an interesting one. I suppose the sort of vision that comes into my head is like, you know, when there's the startup world, they talk about building the plane when they're flying it. So to me, the sort of social entrepreneur is that brave pilot that goes in the journey. The mission is clear, the journey is clear. What that vehicle looks like will vary, but what it needs is the fuel, the investment to make it work. It needs the technical team and the business support around it, the process of innovation to put it together. So there's a lot that goes into creating the environment for social enterprise and organizations and people within that ecosystem of support to make that flight and that journey and that mission happen. Will have their own perspectives and what the right combination and circumstances should be to make that journey possible. But I think what both myself and Neil share is the importance of that skilled and brave pilot, the social entrepreneur that will chart the course, that will navigate the journey, that ultimately will make things happen. And then it's about how we create the conditions behind that person, whatever vehicle they choose, whether it's a train or a plane, or a rocket ship that eventually they launch from.
I think it's very technical, everybody, so forgive me, but it is an issue I'm grappling with, so bear with me. Be short, I promise. But just picking up on, I truly love the approach about it's more about the intentionality. But I know, and this debate is starting to kind of permeate Canada a little bit, in terms of a definition of social entrepreneurship that focuses on asset lock, which is that you reinvest either the majority or all of your profits back in your organization. And there also is, or the community that you serve. And there's also a requirement that if you do sell your organization, it goes to a similarly situated social enterprise. Now, I notice a lot of the documents that Scotland does, for example, your sector survey, does focus on social entrepreneurs that are asset locked. I certainly think asset lock is an important part of the question, but just focusing on asset lock seems to unduly restrict the potential of a social entrepreneurship conversation. I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but are you finding that in Scotland, or how do you approach the balance of respecting the asset lock mentality, but also widening the potential of the conversation for social entrepreneurship?
I think certainly from my point of view, there's been a healthy or unhealthy debate about this for the last 10, 20 years. I think if we start off from the point of that individual in a community that wants to make something happen, usually the circumstances and the market will determine what the best entity or vehicle to bring about that change is, whether it's through a campaign, a traditional charity, an enterprise and non-profit, or an asset-locked or for-profit social enterprise. So there's a variety of mechanisms and vehicles that you can work with and through to make change happen. That will be determined by a range of factors, by the motivation of that individual and the balance between them needing to make a living or profit from it, the level of democratic participation and collective ownership that you want from that endeavour, the ability to lever in outside capital in various forms, the market for that particular product or service. So a very individual and community level, there are a set of circumstances that will determine whether it should or shouldn't be a for-profit or non-profit venture. Then I suppose if you move up a level from a policy point of view, there's a decision by government to decide where limited time, resources and policy attention should be placed. And often this distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit is a simple black and white line for many. There's a lot more nuances, but if it's asset locked, if it's got a social and environmental purpose, and it's non-profit distributing, then usually from a public policy point of view, it's a reasonably safe pair of hands to invest in. Whether that is ultimately the best form, the best vehicle from which to invest capital and to create social change, that will vary from situation to situation. And, you know, we talked about the sector survey. You know, there's the simple thing about determining what should be the scope of this study or what the scope of the policy should be. So usually for-profit, non-profit is a simple dividing line between these things.
Yeah, it has caused controversy though, Dan, I think at an ecosystem level where there are political lines drawn along those definitions that says public money shouldn't go into for-profit individuals and where that money will be distributed to individuals. But like Jonathan, when we're talking about it in a learning context, we always ask the individual, what's your purpose first? To define the business plan, the purpose of what you want to achieve, and then what's the most appropriate legal model to achieve that purpose. And we again differentiate between social entrepreneurs and social enterprises. So you find social entrepreneurs in all sorts of vehicles, as Jonathan's alluded to.
Yeah, well, I think everybody would have an aspiration as much as possible for local goods and services to be owned and controlled by local people, to have as much democratic participation and control. But there are simply some ventures, some endeavors where that will restrict the potential for social change because some legal forms don't allow for profit distribution and equity investment and so on.
Thank you for that. Again, I know was the most dry kind of possibly boring aspect of social entrepreneurship, but just wanted to get it out of the way. Now, Alia is helping us with additional questions and audience. Do you have some questions for us, Alia?
Yeah, we have quite a few and some upvoted. So the one that has the most votes right now is, could you tell us about any big wins, signs that you, since 2015, that you think that we're having momentum, moving the conversation and community towards a more inclusive economy?
You in the spot here. I think one of the things that I find exceptional is the work and unlocking the potential of young people in schools and embracing that new wave of future leaders coming out of schools. And I think that's down to the Social Enterprise Academy, starting that debate at a very early age, which I think is very refreshing.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's been a bit of a journey, that one. It's starting the conversation with young people that asks the question, what do you care about? And then, okay, what business can we run to address that social issue? So we've now just had confirmation from Scottish Government on this current 3-year action plan that they would like us to support the creation of a social enterprise in every school in Scotland. And that's going to be game changing at a cultural and social level in terms of this idea that we can use enterprise to address social problems and that young people have the agency to do that and be involved in it. So it's a fantastic thing. And it's interesting, I think you alluded earlier, Dan, to the issue of action versus activism. And what we're seeing with the young people is not possibly, someone today made the distinction between Generation X and Generation Z, where Generation X are, this is a huge generalization and I didn't make it, so I'm just repeating it, okay, so please don't send me complaints here. But Generation X are typically looking at this from an activism point of view. And actually our young children in the school context are moving towards this with action. And we think that's the bit that's game changing. And one of the expressions I like to share with young people is that social enterprise is compassion in action. It's dependent on action and it's based on compassion. And I think that those two elements together are very, very powerful, and young people just get it. And we're seeing hopefully a whole generation of young people who will come through the school system who understand entrepreneurship can be used for social change.
So I know Alia has some more questions, but just to kind of pick up on that, because it's congratulations, because that's just such an amazing initiative to have the government to commit. Yeah. Neil, how do you actually, even before the mandate, because prior to the mandate, I think it was over 850 primary and secondary schools that you had provided social enterprise programming. How do you actually approach interweaving the social enterprise curriculum into schools?
It's a great question, Dan. Essentially, when we're speaking in a school context, we have to think about the learning outcomes that will be achieved by the young people. Now, in the Scottish education system, they have a thing called the Curriculum for Excellence, which is looking at 4 main pillars of learning for the long term. And the social enterprise program that we run, because it's learning by doing, the young people actually start a social enterprise in the school. So it's experiential in nature and it's pupil-led. So what we've found is that one of the areas that the schools themselves are very interested in is this idea of interdisciplinary learning or cross-curricular learning and programs. And very few things actually attach that learning outcome on a cross-curricular basis. But we've hit upon a program here that meets the needs of the educationalists, but also meets the needs of the social policy that says we want to make this a fairer society. And we've seen some incredible topics. We never ever suggest the social issue that young people should involve themselves with. It's always on the basis of an insightful conversation to say, what is it you care about? And then what can we do about it through an enterprising model? So it's a pretty powerful connection and combination of social, enterprise, and learning outcomes in terms of what young people will need to learn for the future in any case, around critical thinking, around entrepreneurship, around leadership and agency.
And Jonathan, I know you've done a lot of work as well, primarily focused, I think, on post-secondary institutions and bringing social enterprise curriculum to them. Can you describe your journey in working with institutions and what you've learned in that process?
Yeah, I think in terms of post-secondary institutions, you've a number of points of connection from the academic side of the institution, those that are teaching it, from the entrepreneurship centres, those that are encouraging entrepreneurial students to do it, those that are making the connection to employability and careers, and those really within it at the heart of the institution, and the student body as well. So again, to me, and I guess maybe the experience with the academy and schools is it's about starting off by finding those champions, those people within the institution that get it, that you can work with, that can build momentum. And within universities, I guess like schools, what we're trying to do is find authentic ways to connect with young people in ways that matter to them, through digital campaigns, through social channels, to engage with them in the issues that they're passionate about. It's about unlocking passion and providing them with a path. And then it's about equipping them with the skills, the curriculum, working with those delivering startup programs with business schools to say, look, there are tools, there are templates, there's curriculum, there's content that you can use and embed in the learning experience. So I think it's very much been a journey, but it always starts with those individuals that are motivated to make change within that institution and see value in social entrepreneurship and the learning outcomes that can create for pupils and for students. So I think that's where it starts.
Perfect. Alia, you have more questions?
I do. So changing gears a little bit, the next question is, you mentioned the importance of co-producing and moving this community forward. How do you manage stakeholders and different options?
I might come in on that. Jonathan was involved in pulling the whole thing together, and the Academy was involved in leading on 2 of the thematic areas within the strategy. So again, the fact that it was co-produced meant that if we take the schools context as an example, we would pull together any of the stakeholders interested in that conversation to say, how are we going to move this agenda forward in the school context? And we ran a number of focus group type things where Jonathan and Jonathan's team would convene and take notes on from the whole community who was interested in social enterprise education in a school context. So we would have teachers, we would have social entrepreneurs, we would have ourselves who've been involved in a while, all coming together to say, what do we want to put into the long-term strategy? And we can express it in a co-produced way that reflects the views of the ecosystem at large and interested parties more generally. So of all of the different thematic areas, an individual organization from the ecosystem would take a leading role to convene and hold that conversation so that we could reflect the views of the ecosystem, other interested parties, and government would be at the table as well. So you have a policy context as well. So it was genuinely co-produced, and it took some time and it took some effort and money to do that. It wasn't a tokenistic exercise. It was very much us sitting together in dialogue rather than interview or monologue. It was genuinely, generative dialogue that was generating the document that was produced in the end. Is that fair, John?
I think it is, and it's that sort of process doesn't happen in a vacuum. It comes from an existing body of work over a number of years, existing trust between those that are leading in and working in the sector and its various elements. It comes from a sense that it is a broad tent. If we have a vision that's broad and inclusive enough, then at least we can get people to the table. A sense that no one owns this, yet we all own it. And when it came to breaking down the priorities and thinking through, well, how do we scope this area of work? What would it take? What would success look like? What would it take to deliver on that? And who's got a part to play in that? So if you start off with a broad vision and be inclusive in who you involve and let the conversation evolve, then you can shape a broad strategic direction. And I think that's what a 10-year strategy should do. It should give a sense of direction that is fluid enough to evolve in changing circumstances. I think it's you get to the sharp end of things then when it says, well, what action is required to deliver on these broad ambitions, and what resources are required, and who's best placed to deliver on that. I think that's where more difficult decisions and prioritizing priorities and allocating resources becomes, a harder conversation in many ways.
It's interesting, just building on that, what jumps out loud and clear from the Scottish documents is, even though you have an incredibly mature and expert social sector that's supporting social enterprise and leaders, at every step, there's that commitment to also engage the grassroots in that consultation process and the commitment to actually doing it right. So it's amazing to have the discipline with all your assets to still do the hard work and the due diligence of trying your best to get it right. Do you have another question, Alia?
I do. So this one has been upvoted. You've talked a little bit, but I think people still want a little more clarity. How do you clearly define what is not a social enterprise, and how a company becomes a social enterprise?
If I could just build on that question, what I've noticed already in talking to you, which I hadn't picked up on earlier, apologies, is sounds like you differentiate between social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. So would you mind terribly building that into your answer as well?
Sure. Thanks, Neil. So to me, it starts with that social entrepreneur, driven by a social and environmental mission that has that entrepreneurial mindset, that can-do attitude, willingness to take risks. That social entrepreneur will go about delivering change within a community, within society in different ways. Often that change is delivered through bringing people together as part of some sort of entity, often described as a social enterprise. It becomes then more problematic about, well, which of those enterprises or organizations are social enterprises and which aren't. And usually the gray area is somewhere between what's a charity and non-profit and what's a company, and what's this space in between that we tend to define as some sort of social enterprise entity. And that changes from country to country, and even within a country as small as Scotland, there are quite different interpretations of what can be characterized and described as a social enterprise and what can't. Usually there's broad agreement in many of those characteristics. It will have a social or environmental purpose. It's there to deliver the public good. It's independent in terms of its governance and management. Then it usually comes down to the point of debate around where the money comes from and what happens to that money once it's in the organization. Often countries or policy tends to make a distinction between around the sort of level of earned income. So if you generate more than half of your income from trading, you might be described as a social enterprise. And often it's what happens to that money. Does it just go into private individuals' pockets, or is it reinvested for the social good? So in Scotland, generally, it's looked at in a sort of non-profit way. The social enterprise as an organization is one that generates a significant amount of money through trading, and it continues to reinvest that income in the mission and community of benefit. But that interpretation will vary from place to place. But I think it's helpful to make that distinction between the individual, the social entrepreneur, and the social enterprise as the entity, and maybe the social innovation, which is the process of making change happen.
I think the only thing I would add to what Jonathan's saying is, if you think of it as a continuum, where on one end of the spectrum you've got traditional charity dependent on philanthropy, and the other end of the spectrum, pure profit, for-profit business. The distinction between social enterprise and charity has been fairly well defined as this idea of relying and moving towards a trading income rather than a philanthropic income. The grey area now, I think, is coming between the social enterprise and the private sector entity who is doing something on an environmental or social basis. So, and I think that's why the question becomes so pertinent. Is something that's creating wind farms a social enterprise? And I think there is a relevant question to ask in terms of where does the profit go? And I think that's part of the debate in terms of what defines a social enterprise. Now, the person who may have started that business could be a social entrepreneur doing it for the best of intentions, but has created a private sector model because that's the only way they could get the relevant investment in to achieve that social aim. And the profit may be well invested back into the purpose, but the legal entity is still a for-profit model, so it couldn't be called a social enterprise, but he is a social entrepreneur or she is a social entrepreneur. So it's quite confusing, and that's why we try, I think, to prefer to focus on social entrepreneurship as a verb rather than saying what is or isn't a social enterprise. And that can be left to the lawyers, really.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to leave it to, if there's a certain funder that you're seeking, what their definition of social entrepreneurship is, if it's a government program or support, what their definition is. And the rest is, again, the verb side of things, which is focusing on why you're wanting to call yourself a social enterprise and how you're wanting to use markets to solve social problems, and then just building on that conversation.
I think one of the issues that hasn't come up yet, Dan, is that some people feel in the ecosystem that people are going to abuse the term to access funding that they shouldn't otherwise access. So they feel a bit defensive about this idea that people are going to call themselves a social enterprise, but in fact their motivation is to access grant funding and then make an exit for personal gain. And we don't see very much of that, to be honest, but there is an anxiety around the place about that happening sometimes.
Sure. Alia, do you have some more questions?
Yes, we do. There's one that kind of ties into this, what you've been talking about, but also the international coordination. So the question is, should there be more international coordination amongst countries around social enterprises? How could we make that happen?
Well, it's a good question. Both Jonathan and I are involved in international places. The Social Enterprise World Forum, obviously, which is happening throughout the year, I think has been a good attempt at that, but it's just so difficult. We have a replication franchise model where we're replicating the Academy's work in other countries, and we've done some analysis on where are the ecosystems around the world that recognize social entrepreneurship. And it's so variable in so many countries that I think it would be a very difficult thing to achieve on that basis. It means different things to different countries, and sometimes the words are problematic themselves. One quick example that Jonathan and I were both involved in some years ago was a project in Poland where the term social enterprise was treated with a great deal of mistrust because they were making connotations back to socialism and the relationship they had with Russia historically. So the term social enterprise wasn't helpful in that debate at all. And in other countries, the terms are used in different ways. So I don't see it being rationalized.
Yeah, so I suppose it's more about the sort of global movement that's been developing around social enterprise. And it's fair to say that between countries, between governments, between policymakers, between those responsible for policy and funding, there seems to be quite a lot of cooperation and networking and sharing of expertise when it comes to the policy making and policy interventions to support the social economy, however that's defined and described in countries, which I think is really positive. And then I suppose at a practitioner or social enterprise leader level, there's lots of conferences, and increasingly, the social entrepreneurs that we come into contact with feel part of something greater than is happening in their community or city or country. So there's lots of, they feel part of a bigger movement, whether that's the climate movement or the various social movements that we see developing. And I think that's an entirely positive thing, where we all get the opportunity to develop more of a global outlook and shared issues, and the opportunity at events like this to share our experiences and to actually take some time out to reflect. So I don't know if it's as much about a sort of shared global policy agenda as much as trying to share the knowledge and expertise rather than constantly reinvent ideas of social enterprise and how best to support it. So the more that we can share, the more that we can learn from each other's experiences, the better.
Can I just pick up on that point, because it's something I do struggle with as an ecosystem builder in the Alberta context. I don't know why, but there's this tendency when you try to bring together ecosystem to want to focus on sameness or homogeneity, whereas a thriving ecosystem actually is not the same, it's diverse. And I don't know why we don't naturally tend towards more celebrating our diversity. So if people have a slightly different approach to social enterprise or a different phrase, but it's similar technique, is actually leaning into that diversity and celebrating it and say, if you have this different approach, go do it, and then bring back what you're learning from it and how we can share those learnings and improve. It's sounding like your experience as well with a lot of networks is sameness tends to dominate the conversation as a goal, as opposed to let's actually celebrate how we're different and how we can actually learn from each other.
So I don't know whether the intention is ever to create a sort of one-size-fits-all model of supporting social enterprise. But I think when it comes to policy interventions, government support and strategy, inevitably there needs to be some sort of centralized way of coordinating and organizing how things are supported. And sometimes it's about simplicity. Diversity is often a complicated and complex thing when it comes to public policy making and funding. So the simpler sometimes that government can make things in terms of the number of partners it works with, the size of programs, their expectation of achieving national coverage or provincial coverage of something so that everyone benefits from public money. I think often it's that sort of approach then becomes quite uniform and quite centralized, and it becomes one program rather than a diversity of providers responding, because it just becomes more complicated of managing all of those relationships, whether funding or whatever. So I don't think the intention is for things to be very uniform and unorganized, but I think that's often the way that it defaults sometimes.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead.
We have a question just to backtrack a little bit on the thought around the socialism and word. So the question is social enterprise considered socialism, and therefore more socialist countries seem to be more accepting of social enterprise, in your perspective?
Well, in that example I was giving, because Poland had been under Soviet rule before then, they saw it as highly suspicious. Was this another form of socialism coming in through the back door? So it really was the language and terminology. So it was second language for the people we're speaking to, and they were just suspicious of, is this a form of socialism, because they had suffered so badly under that regime historically. I don't think it was a critique on social enterprise or social entrepreneurship per se. It was really a language issue more than anything else. Right? You were there, Jonathan, yeah?
Yeah, and I think in a UK perspective, if we look at it from a political perspective, from the left and right of politics, I think social enterprises, this idea of social enterprises, achieve broad support in politics. If you look at it maybe from the right and an enterprise perspective, it's a way of creating an entrepreneurial culture and more enterprise and more economic growth. And from the left of politics, it's a way of creating a more fair and equal society. We focus on the social or we focus on the enterprise, but ultimately, it's somewhere in the middle of politics, and it's broadly acceptable, certainly in our context.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the same vein, I think there's another question about, and I don't know if you know this, but how popular might social enterprises be in the United States, given that it might be associated with socialism and therefore despised by people or despised by the term?
It's an interesting one. My sense of it in the States, you guys are obviously closer to this than we are, but because of the not-for-profit model that's there, the social enterprise terminology hasn't taken off terribly well. So the Social Enterprise Alliance that was set up by Ger Boshi in the 80s, I think, the 90s, hasn't grabbed a lot of traction relative to the kind of not-for-profit sector, which is seen more on the basis of philanthropy, is my sense of it. I think in the UK context, where you've got a bigger welfare state, the idea of social enterprise being part of the solution becomes more readily accepted. Your take is on?
I don't think I'll get involved in American politics in any way or active in that. I suppose whatever you say will get the support of half of the American population.
Exactly.
And half won't. So I generally think it's about the language that we use. I think no one would disagree with making the country and society better. No one would argue with this idea of creating jobs, creating economic growth, and no one would probably argue with the idea of combining this, but it's how you describe it, it's how you present it, and sometimes that's viewed as threatening to some, others are very supportive. So and it goes on anyway, whether it's recognized, whether it's described as such. You know, the idea of entrepreneurs doing good and creating business models that solve problems for society isn't a new one, whether it's recognized by policy or accepted in the US or not.
We have a question that takes us in a bit of a different direction now. So earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the importance of having a sense of direction that is fluid enough to evolve. Can you talk about any major changes or evolutions that have impacted your original direction and how you navigated them, please?
So just passing that straight to me. I suppose the obvious one that springs to mind, not very readily, obviously, is what's happened with COVID. So that just became a completely left field event, which, with the pandemic and lockdown, and you know, the whole sense of community and people just mucking in to jump onto things, suddenly took the conversation in a different direction. Similarly, Black Lives Matter, similarly, diversity and inclusion more generally. So those three things, I think, have come in from left field and shaped the conversation in a way that we didn't anticipate at the beginning of the 10-year strategy period. And we're having to adapt to that and move it along. Another thing that's coming to mind is women into enterprise as well. Globally is becoming a theme that is gathering momentum as well as part of that agenda. So the conversation evolves slightly and moves with these external things, but the essence of the plan isn't changing. That the idea is to have an ecosystem that creates the conditions under which social entrepreneurship can thrive, and people who have solutions to these problems can step forward and get involved. That's really all I've got.
I think that's right, and the inputs don't change in a sense, regardless of what those opportunities and threats come up for individual social enterprises or social entrepreneurs or markets or the economy in general. To create an effective social enterprise sector, you need to bring capital, you need to bring expertise, you need to bring other inputs and supports to make that successful. What you need to do and the circumstances might change, but I think the basic foundations don't necessarily change.
Thank you. So now there's two questions that are similar, so I'm going to combine them. One of them is, how did you successfully influence government, and what were the prime strategies you used? And the other side is, what can legislators do from a policy perspective to help facilitate, encourage, and grow social enterprise?
I think taking the first one, if I may, the thing that always struck me is quite impactful was the original conversation 15, 20 years ago was about differentiating social entrepreneurship or social enterprise from traditional charity. And it always struck me that the civil servants are particularly expert at reading documentation. But even with the civil servants, it was when we took them along to a social enterprise to say, here's how a social enterprise approaches these issues, they kind of went, got it now. And it was only after seeing, touching and feeling the reality of social enterprise on the ground that that needle started to shift, which I always thought was really interesting, because on paper, it sounds very similar to a philanthropic charitable thing, but it was only when the visit took place that the penny seemed to drop.
think that's a very good point. And I suppose the second part of the question then is how public policymakers can influence and support social enterprises. I think if we look at the responsibilities of government, whether federal, provincial, there are responsibilities for transport, for daycare, for healthcare, for energy, for all of the things that make for better services to meet the needs of people. And there are people within government that set the rules of the game, essentially within what are markets for social enterprises. The public transport or sustainable transport strategy, that's a market opportunity for social enterprise transport providers. Likewise, daycare, healthcare, all of these other things. So it's about setting the rules of the game, setting the policy parameters, setting the legislation, setting the regulation, setting the funding mechanisms to incentivize different forms of transport or renewable energy. So within every area of public policy, that policymaker or legislator has the opportunity to set the rules in the game in favor of social sector, community-led providers, or larger state provision, or larger corporations. So it's the way that market opportunities are shaped to deliver public services that I think is quite a profound opportunity to shape the market opportunities for the sector.
Well, building on that, there's also the aspect that it's actually an ongoing conversation, right? It's not just a one of. So the government is constantly co-creating with you. It has the sector survey every 2 years that then informs it to make decisions, as well as the ongoing consultation with not only the support ecosystem, but the grassroots itself. Just quickly, before we get to Alia's next question, given that you have this co-creation with government, it can be challenging because sometimes governments can change and certainly ministers can change. As a sector, how do you kind of keep the ball rolling, even though government can have those kinds of changes?
I think we've been very fortunate in Scotland that the political context hasn't changed during this time period. So you've had a very stable government situation. The thing that's changed is individual civil servants. And I think that comes down to relationship management, stakeholder management, and making sure that as new people come in, they buy into the same policy and approach position. So I think we've been fairly fortunate, and it hasn't been too volatile politically here for some years. We've had a Scottish national government in place since 2005 or 6.
It's that long ago, we can't put a date to it.
I think it's 2007 actually, yeah. But it's a long time, and they've adopted the conversation that we'd had with the pre-existing government, which was Labour at the time. So it has been fairly, and as Jonathan said as well, in this context, it's fairly universally accepted that this is a good thing for the society, and it's not a massive political football compared to something like education or something like healthcare, which are the big ticket items that get a huge amount of expenditure and a huge amount of political analysis. So the investment that comes into the social economy has been pretty stable for a long time, and it's been acknowledged that social enterprise has got a role to play when compared with traditional charity, and the strategic partners that have been made up as part of the ecosystem are in place to support charities to become more sustainable over time as well, where appropriate.
So we have many questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask one quick one, I hope, and then one I'll save for just after. So the first one I would like to bring to you is, do you consider Bill Gates and his creative capitalism to be a type of social enterprise? And would you consider Bill Gates and his foundation work to be social entrepreneurship?
You answer that one as well, Jonathan, passing that to me. I don't know a great deal about the Bill Gates Foundation. It sounds by definition to be philanthropic in nature in terms of investing a lot of money in social issues. So I would have suggested that that's a traditional fund giving foundation rather than a social enterprise one. I could be completely wrong. I don't have the detail, so I'm just making assumptions.
I think it's fair to say that Bill Gates obviously comes from the idea of markets, technology, and innovation can solve the world's problems. Perhaps the fund that he created through the Gates Foundation is perhaps more focused on innovation than social enterprise as such as the vehicle for delivering change. Certainly a lot of the investments seem to me to be in ways to deal with big ticket items around health, around climate, and how do we drive innovation and systems change more so than using social enterprise necessarily as the vehicle for change.
Thank you. So the last one is about COP26. And if there was anything that is relevant to social entrepreneurship in this area, we only have a couple of minutes, so I'll leave that to you and then Dan for final words.
So obviously COP26, I can say I was involved because I live in Glasgow, involved in some fringe events that wouldn't let me into the main event, obviously. But I think obviously when we talk about social entrepreneurship, one of the big things that we were involved through Social Shifters in this year was our Global Innovation Challenge and involving Trico Foundation in Canada. And what we found was that so many of the young people that were motivated and mobilized through that, and so many of the solutions related to climate, quite remarkable in terms of the range of innovations and the young climate entrepreneurs coming forward. So it's clear to me that sort of that passion to solve these big issues around climate combined with an entrepreneurial mindset and creating the conditions where these young people can come forward and creating some seed capital for them to take their ideas to the next level. It gives me great hope for the future that these issues can be solved by the many young people that are on the streets and coming up with ideas and, as we've said, taking action, which is absolutely the critical bit through bringing these ideas to life. It perhaps gives me more hope for the future than some of the discussion at the actual COP26 climate change conference itself.
Thank you. Dan, over to you. Any final comments?
Yes, just bearing in mind we have about 3 minutes. You both have been neck deep in a country that's trying to push the envelope on social entrepreneurship. Very briefly, has there been like a key aha moment that we haven't talked about that would be an insight that could really help us in Canada and Alberta as we try to build a similar ecosystem? We'll start maybe with Neil first.
What's jumping to my mind is it sounds self-serving, but for me, the realization that there's 3 legs to that stool of support, which is business support and competency-based, advice and guidance, investment in the social enterprises, and then the learning and development for the individual social entrepreneur. So I think against a backdrop of policy, but those 3 things together, making a complementary tripartite rather than competing or moving things apart.
Jonathan?
And for me, I think it's really about reflecting and the revolution that's underway. Young people in the schools that Neil and the academy are involved in, post-secondary institutions. It's about how do we, as a country and society, really create the conditions for those young people to really move from ideas to action and create the conditions around that. And I think if we embrace those ideas and the potential of young people, it gets us away from this very blinkered idea of what's charity and what's business. A problem's a problem and a solution's a solution. And if young people can take action in that, I think that's what we should be looking towards, rather than looking at very traditional views of how we should go about taking things forward in the social economy.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. And for our audience, this wasn't the beginning of our conversation of what we can learn with Scotland. It certainly won't be the end. So we will collect the questions that weren't asked and see if we can get that information later, and certainly continue the dialogue with Neil, Jonathan, and other people from Scotland. So thank you both so much for this conversation. Thanks everybody for sending in their questions.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you.